Okay, so this is the Bible study for 2 Samuel chapters 8 and 9, and also 1 Chronicles 18, which is the equivalent text in 1 Chronicles. It says, in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in the battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of A.L.I.V.E, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sarai was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? To whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodabar. So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth. At your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, And all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. All right. We're not going to read the Second Chronicles text because for the most part it says the same thing. Number one, remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. Number one says, what happened in our last Bible study in 2 Samuel 7? A, David realized that he was living in a house of cedar while God was dwelling in a tent. So he wanted to build a house for God. That's true. B, he told the prophet Nathan what he wanted to do, and Nathan told him to do what he had in his head to do. That's true. C, God spoke to Nathan overnight and told him to tell David that it wouldn't be him who builds a house for the Lord, but his son who would be king after him. That's true. And D, David prayed and praised the Lord for his promises and all that he had done for him. And that's true also. Number two, what happens in 2 Samuel 8:1-14? So that's the beginning of today's text. A, David defeated the Philistines. B, David defeated the Moabites. C, David defeated the king of Zobah. D, David defeated the Arameans. I'm sensing a pattern. E, the king of Hamath heard about David's victory and sent his son to bring gifts, probably so David didn't defeat them too. And that's probably true. I mean, also, it says that he had been at war with Tau. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But that's one thing. That definitely happened. F, David struck down 18,000 Edomites, and the Edomites became subject to him. And G, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So I would just say that these are obviously summaries. We don't have every detail of the battle. Sometimes in 1st and 2nd Samuel, whether it's with Saul or with David, we've heard a lot of details of the battle, and they went here, and this is how they attacked, and this is how they infiltrated, and this was what the battlefield looked like, and they were on either side of a pass, and that sort of thing. But we don't have that here. We just have sort of summaries. He defeated them, he defeated them, he defeated them. So we have to believe that the individual victories were not as significant to the writer who wrote this chapter as the overall impression that he wanted us to get, which was then sort of confirmed twice within the text, and that is the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So we don't have every detail of every battle, but we have the outcomes of all these battles. And so what I'm trying to get at is, why does the writer include this? Why does God direct or allow the writer to put this in what we now have as scripture? And there's got to be an answer. It's here for a purpose. What are we intended to learn from this? And sometimes it may be, every detail of the battle, and God directed the battle, and David asked for, direction and where he should go and where he should attack or whatever. Sometimes we're intended, I believe, to hear that David went to God for direction. Just because we don't have that in this passage doesn't mean that he didn't. But what it may mean is that's not the intended communication that the writer and God through this writer are trying to get across to us. So we have other communication, we have other intentions in other places where it's important that the writer get across to us that David was seeking God's direction. In this text, he's intending, I believe, to express to us that David had victory, and it was vast, and it was he put garrisons in places. He put garrisons in Damascus, he put garrisons in I believe Moab. He put people like occupying forces in their neighbors. So under Saul and pretty much under every leader, not king before Saul, but every leader prior to that, all the way back to when they took the promised land, they had not defeated many of these many of the groups, including the Philistines, that still dwelt in their land. The Jebusites, for instance, still dwelling in Jerusalem before David came. By contrast, when David became king, they subdued everybody within their land and began to send occupying forces into their neighbor's land. So they ruled the entire area, and it was not like it was before, where there was constant attacks from these other groups, but rather they were in charge. Israel was ruling this area, and for the most part that carried on into the reign of Solomon, whose kingdom stretched even farther. So I guess it's important to understand that the purpose of the writing of this was not to break down every battle, but rather to show that God was with David. And this was very different from what had happened with Saul, who was still trying to beat back the Philistines from their constant raiding. But here David came in and subdued all their enemies, and so they were in charge in their land and in the surrounding lands. And the writer tells us that that's because the Lord gave David victory. It's because David was listening to the Lord, following the Lord, doing what the Lord said, and the Lord gave him victory. So number 3 says, what does 8:15 say about David? It says David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. So now this is very connected. If David was doing what God said, God had looked for a just and right leader. God wants a leader who cares for his people and does what's right and brings about justice. That's what God cares about with his people. And so David was one who was listening to God, and therefore he did what was just and right for all the people. And so we know that about David and his reign, and that was important. Now we find out also in those next few verses who David set up as leaders, as officials leading different aspects of the kingdom. So we find out that he must have been pretty wise in his governing practices and how he oversaw things as well. We never heard whether Saul was or wasn't, or what sort of leader Saul was. But we find out that David is not just a great military leader, but it seems like he's a good administrative leader as well, in how he sets trustworthy people over certain departments or certain responsibilities that were important to the kingdom, so that it wasn't just David who was just and right, but so that David's intentions for how he governed the people got across and through to how the people were actually governed, because David doesn't have direct contact with everybody in the kingdom. Who, as a leader, we know this, who you put in charge of certain things, if they follow your heart, if you're with God's heart, and David was a man after God's own heart, those people need to understand your heart and carry out their responsibilities in the same way you would, or else it doesn't matter that you're a just and right king or leader. The governance is not happening in a just and right manner, perhaps because people aren't following what your desire is. And so it seems like David was, anyway, as I said, not just a good military leader, but also a good administrative leader in how he put people in charge of certain things. Number 4, what did David do in 9:1-4? It says, David asked, is there anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Um, Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. The king said, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? Now, let me just say this. Um, I'm not sure about this, but it seems to make sense to me that David has defeated Saul. David has defeated Saul's household. Um, David has been made king, that it would be relatively easy for David to lay claim to the previous king's stuff and servants and people. And so it may have been, he's married to one of the king's daughters, one of Saul's daughters. It seems that it wouldn't be outside of the realm of possibility that Ziba in and said, hey, I'm going to take all your stuff, all, your master's stuff. um Obviously that's not what David would do, and that's not what he did. um but rather, and by the way, remember this, that ever since the book of Joshua, when they took and they were given the inheritance that God intended for them in the promised land, each family had inheritance. So each family had land. So there was a designated spot where Saul's family had their inheritance, land and whatever came with that. Um, and so there was something designated there. Um, Perhaps some level of that would have not gone to David no matter what. It would have had to go to the descendants by law, but I think, if there were still a lot of servants, if there were still a lot of possessions beyond the land, then clearly there's a sort of a designated inheritance that Ziba still is overseeing at this point. And so David calls him in, and what does he ask? He asks, who of Saul's household can I show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? Is anybody still alive? I know his sons were killed. I know, Saul was killed. Who's still left? And Ziba tells him that there is a son. In the second part of verse 3, there's still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. And the king asks, where is he? And Ziba answered, see, this seems dangerous in and of itself. What if I don't tell the king where he is? But if I do, is the king going to kill him? But surely at this point, we understand David better than that, I hope. So then it says in the second part of number 4, what did David do when he found out about the son of Jonathan, according to 9:5? And oh, by the way, where have we heard about this before? So remember, there was sort of a parenthetical verse in a previous chapter, 3 or 4 chapters ago, that told us, oh yeah, there was a son, Mephibosheth, where previously we would not have known, but now we already know when we read this what the answer to this is going to be. And in 9:5, it says, so King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. So he had him brought to him. And Mephibosheth bows down because, I'm getting into number 5. Number 5 says, what happened when Mephibosheth arrived, according to 9:6-11? A, Mephibosheth bowed down to pay David honor. B, David called him by name and told him not to be afraid. C, David told him that he would show kindness for the sake of his father Jonathan and restore to him all the land belonged to. Think about this. That land had been multiplied, that the fruitfulness of the land, the servants, everything had been multiplied by Saul being king. So it's likely that Saul's possessions and land beyond just the inheritance that would have been given to him through his family, but that Saul's possession had been expanded by him being king, and loot from attacking things and that sort of thing. And so Saul, my guess would be Saul's possessions would have been at this point second only to David's. And David has more than just his ancestral home too, because now he's taken Jerusalem and he has the city and control of this, and lives in the fortress there. And so Saul probably has almost as much as David, and David could have readjusted all that or whatever, but he's basically making sure that Mephibosheth, whether somebody else would have cheated him out of it, or whether he as king could have usurped and taken some of this, either way he makes sure that Mephibosheth gets it all. And which is fair and right and just, which is what we just read about David, but probably not what we would have expected most kings to do when they came into power, to do with the descendant of their enemy. Now, that being said, we know of David's relationship with Jonathan and how significant it would have been, regardless of what Saul did to him, for him to honor Jonathan. And that's what he says. That's why he says he's doing this. Indeed, David told him he would always eat at his table. He instructed Saul's steward to farm the land and take care of it and bring everything to Mephibosheth. So not just is he giving him the land, not just is he inviting Mephibosheth to his table to eat with him like family, but also David is making sure that the land is taken care of well by those who've already been taken care of it, and he's going to make sure that all of that is brought in and gets to Mephibosheth. So he becomes almost like a guardian, in our modern terms, overseeing Mephibosheth's staff. Now is his household, Saul's household, and staff, and making sure that all of that gets to Mephibosheth, rather than it somehow not getting to him and him being cheated out of it because he was unable to speak or fight for himself, because of his physical handicap. Number 6 says, how did Mephibosheth respond according to 9:8? It says he bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? So to be clear, in our culture today, we have a lot of protections for those who are disabled in some way, such that law protects them. Accessibility is important to us, which even probably 50 years ago was not a thing here in America. But that's the truth here. There, in many cases, we see this even in the time of Jesus, birth deformities and things like that could be considered a sign of sinfulness, or that you're not watched over by God. In their cultural thinking, Jesus tried to undo some of that as well. But I'm saying, so this comment, a dead dog like me, we may say, oh, he's got depression, or maybe he's just being humble. But I think it might have been more than that, that's what everybody else considered him. So what was it that David did not consider him that way? I know we've talked about that, that sometimes the kings may have been responsible for taking care of some people in their um, in their kingdom, like that needed that assistance. But it would have certainly been easier for the son of a previous king, who somebody might have said should be the rightful king, for him to just kill him. But none of that's what's happening. Number 7, how do we treat people who are weak and without influence when we are in a place of power and authority? So this is what David did. What do we do? And I'll just say this, that God cares for the people that are weak and without influence. We find numerous times in the Old Testament talk of the widows and the orphans, caring for the widows and the orphans and the foreigners that live among you who don't have an inheritance, they don't have any land, so they're probably poor. We find Jesus coming to the people that needed help and needed a touch and bringing healing. So we know what Scripture teaches we should do. And I think probably if we're Christians, we already know we shouldn't be mistreating people who are weak and without authority. But I think sometimes we may be too busy or just be unwilling to fight for justice for those who are weak and without influence. When we have influence or we have power and authority, it may not be popular for us to fight for somebody like that, and so we may just let it go. And I would just say that we need to take on David as an example in this area, that David takes care of those who can't take care of themselves, and he sees that as his responsibility, in part because of the relationship he had with Jonathan, in part because of the respect he had for God's anointed in Saul. But I think just in general, David did what was just and right. And this is what is just and right. And so I think we probably need to do a better job. I think culturally, it's becoming a value to do these sorts of things. Unfortunately, it's a political issue sometimes, and Christians can sometimes find ourselves, I think, on the wrong side of the justice and doing what is just and right, because it's become a political issue, and it's maybe not what our particular political persuasion thinks we should do. And I just want to say that the Bible's not about politics, and Christianity is not about politics, and we do what's right no matter what the political parties say. And I don't think either political party generally does what is right. They do what's most beneficial to them, usually, it seems. And so we need to do what is right, even when it's not beneficial to us, even when it's something that we're called to do for somebody else. So anyway, just a thought. I think we could do better.